In today's video, I'm going to give you a little tour of the 31 drawings that I completed this past October. This was my third year doing a variation of Inktober that I call Housetober. And in that, I do different categories of houses that people could live in or do live in. And some of them are normal structures, and as I progressed throughout the years, I'm more gravitated towards unique structures. I made a video about how I prepared this year, and I'll link that in the description for anybody who's interested. But before I proceed with the tour, I'll give you a little overview of the supplies that I used for all of these little ink drawings. All the supplies that I used fit into my little mini Sendak. And the interesting thing is that I've never really liked my mini Sendak so much. I've always really loved my normal sized Sendak, which if you don't know what that is, I will link a video all about that as well. But I loved the mini Sendak for this challenge because it held everything that I needed, and it's such a sweet little package that I could take it anywhere. I did most of these drawings sitting on the sofa while we were watching TV, and I could put it next to me on the sofa like this, and I could easily grab everything that I needed. In these pockets are a variety of different Staedtler pigment liners, and the sizes I used were the 0.05, 0.1, 0.3, and 0.5, although the two that I used the most were the 0.05 and the 0.1. If I needed really dark areas, I would go in with a 0.3 or 0.5, and I was really grateful to have those. And I did all of the drawings that you're going to see with these 4 fine liners, with the exception of maybe the first 8 where I used the Prismacolor Premier fine liners. And I do have a video for anybody who's interested that I'll link that compares 8 different popular fine liners on the market. And these were the 2 that I liked the best. In past years, I've used the Prismacolor for this challenge, but this year was the first year that I really focused heavily on the Staedtler, and I really loved using them. I started each drawing with a little pencil sketch, and for that I used the Pentel Graph Gear 500 with the 0.5mm lead. And I used this little Tombow Mono Zero eraser for when I needed to erase really fine areas. This was perfect for that. And I used this shish kebab skewer a lot just to measure angles or different distances between objects or items in each drawing. I also used these 2 masking fluid markers for drawings that had a lot of areas that I wanted to preserve as white. I didn't use this all the time, but occasionally there were some windows or some foliage that I really wanted to keep white, so these were really useful. The Molotow has a 2mm nib, and this other one is new to me. It's a Goya Creole. I don't really know how to pronounce that. But this one has a finer nib, and so it was really good for windows, but I didn't find that the masking fluid flowed out of the nib as effortlessly as it did with the Molotow. So if I could only choose one, it would still be this one. But I did use them both, and they were handy to have. I also used my academic divider for all of these drawings. I was a lot more technical this year with my drawings than I have been in previous years. And so I did a lot of measuring points for where I wanted things to be to make sure that all of the proportions were correct. I don't think I'll ever do another Housetober using one of these as much as I did, because I ended up spending between 3 hours to 5 hours on every single one of these drawings, and it was simply because I used this. If you're new to drawing, however, this is a really useful tool for helping you understand perspective and proportions, and it's a good way to train your eye. I have a video that I'll link about this that also gives some tips about how to use it for anyone that's interested. And then I had a ruler, which is always useful when you're drawing architecture, and some scrap paper for getting the masking fluid started or for any techniques that I wanted to practice. And then in this pouch, I kept my kneaded eraser in this little tin, and this got a lot of use for erasing any of the initial sketches. It was nice because I could just put it in here and put it next to me on the table and I wouldn't lose it. And then I also have this little piece of natural rubber that I used for picking up any of the masking fluid. And you can see that it gets really dirty with a lot of use. This was brand new and clean when I started, and I'll probably go ahead and trim some of these edges off for future drawings. I have a little bit of extra lead in here that I used once to replenish my mechanical pencil. And then I also have my knitting needles that I like to use for measuring. I initially had these in one of the pockets, but I did have a little domestic accident where I accidentally stabbed my thigh. So after that, I thought these are gonna live in here so that I don't have any more accidents. And that's it for the supplies. This was everything I needed. I did have some napkins or some tissues in the back. I didn't need those. Those are more for watercolor. But I loved the way that this whole thing folded up, and I could put this and my little drawing clipboard in a bag and just carry them downstairs every time that I needed to do a drawing. I used this little clipboard to hold all of the little drawings. When I first started, I planned to use this Sea White of Brighton postcard paper, and I've used this in the past and I've loved it for ink drawing. But after I did the first drawing, I noticed that the paper didn't feel the way that it used to feel. It felt a lot more waxy. So I decided to make my own postcards using this LinkedIn Prestige 100% cotton cold pressed watercolor paper, which has a much nicer texture. So I cut 30 of those and used those for the last 30 drawings. And that was my supplies. So let's now get on to the tour. Each of these drawings is about 4.5 by 6 inches. And this year I did 8 different categories. So the themes I used this year were lighthouses, shop fronts, barns, churches, castles, cottages, clock towers, and houseboats. I'll do a little bit of a split screen for some of these where I'll show you some of the process of drawing it up in the left-hand corner. The first category were lighthouses. In past years, I've taken my own photographs, but this year I did something a little bit different. I made a Pinterest board and I used mostly other people's images, although there are a few that a friend of mine took or I took. So I don't know as much about these as I normally would, but I'll give you the information that I do have, and you can play detective. If you know something about any of these buildings that I'm going to show you, please do let me know in the comments. This first lighthouse really captured my attention because I loved all of the foliage in the foreground and the fact that it has this open space to be able to paint in a sky later. I should mention that I do take all of these ink drawings that I do, and I have my printer print them on some watercolor paper so that I can paint them throughout the year. And I can also sell them, but I can paint them multiple times, which takes some of the stress off of potentially ruining a drawing that you spent hours on. Like I said, this drawing used some of the paper from the Sea White of Brighton, and I really was struggling with it and finding that it felt a lot more like a hot press paper. And so this is the only one that's actually drawn on that paper. All of the others are drawn on the Saunders Waterford. And this one is Truro Island Lighthouse in Ontario, Canada. And I think this one might be one of my favorites from the entire month. I love the structure. I also like the way that I handled some of the foliage in the foreground. And it just feels very romantic. You can imagine what it must have been like when somebody was living in this house and tending the tower. There's something about lighthouses that is so romantic, and I always love drawing them for that reason. And this third one is an abandoned lighthouse somewhere in Russia. The only information I could find about this one is that it's an abandoned nuclear lighthouse. I did try to make my version a little less abandoned looking and to make it seem a little bit more hospitable than the image in the photograph, which is the nice thing about drawing, that as an artist, you have the license to make your building anything that you want. And in fact, for all of these drawings, I did use some creative license on the way that I presented them. I debated on this one about whether or not to draw in the birds that were in the photograph, and in the end, I did decide to draw them in, although I did place them a little bit differently than they were in the picture. But I think they add a nice element of life to this abandoned lighthouse. And I also really love this drawing. This is of a lighthouse, and I'm not sure where it is, Somebody in the comments on Pinterest wrote that they thought it was in Norway, which is definitely possible. Again, this is one of the ones that if you know where it is, please let me know, because I would love to be able to see more photographs of this one and maybe even visit it someday. Some of the challenges with drawing this one were trying to portray the mountains in the background and the flowers in the foreground and also the rocks. And I think overall I did a pretty good job. I'm really excited to paint this one. It's going to be a lot of fun. So these are the lighthouses. And like I said, I spent a lot of time doing all of these drawings, trying to work out and make it a little bit more photorealistic than I normally would sketch. But one of the nice things I like about doing this daily drawing challenge in October is the opportunity to revisit my drawing, because my drawing is the foundation for all of the art that I create. Let me know which one of these is your favorite. I would really like to know. The next category are shop fronts, and I initially thought these would be pretty easy when I selected this as a theme, and these about broke me. They were among the most complicated of everything that I drew because of all the details in the windows and also because of the symmetry. Because I wanted it to look a little bit borderline realistic, I really had to focus on making my lines straighter than I normally would worry about. And I also had to be really careful to get all of my values correct. This first one is of the Sugar and Layer Cake Company up north in England. And sadly, when I was doing my research, I discovered that this shop is now permanently closed, even though it had really excellent reviews. But that's one of the things I really love about art. I'm able to now have this little shop live on forever in this drawing. One of the things I really loved is this reflection of the car in the window. And like I said, it's one of those drawings that looks deceptively simple, meaning there was really nothing simple about drawing it, but I'm pretty pleased with this one, and I'm really going to have fun painting it because all of this woodwork is pink. This next shop front is called The Open Book, and it's in Richmond upon Thames, which is a London borough slightly to the west of London, and it's an independent bookstore. I loved these windows and doing the lace curtains. I did use masking fluid for that. And my daughter really loved this one when I showed her the photo, and she said the only thing that would make it better is if I put a cat in it. So I did add a little cat to the window up here. It wasn't as difficult as I worried that it would be to put all these little books in the shop front and all of the little flyers up on the windows. And this one is going to be a lot of fun to paint as well. I did take a day off after the first two because, like I said, I spent way more time than I actually anticipated drawing those. So this one I actually drew at the end of the month. In fact, I drew this one in November, but this is the space where it would have been had I not taken a day off. And this is a bookstore named Linden Books, which is in Lincoln, United Kingdom. The photograph was especially arresting because it had this beautiful green painted woodwork, and in the front was an old vintage car that was also green. So this one again is probably going to be really exciting once I add some paint to it. And again, putting the bunting and on the suggestion of all the different books in the windows was a lot of fun on this one. I did worry that maybe my values were a little bit too dark, but again, I think when I come in with the paint that will take care of itself. And the final one is called Sunday Sunday, a seaside store. And this is in Whitstable, Kent, which is to the east of London, and it's on the coast. So it's a nice little coastal town. This was probably the most challenging of all the windows to try to give an impression of the things that were hanging up there without being too detailed. And again, there's a little kitty in this window, which is a theme that you're going to see in some of my other drawings later. I did enjoy drawing all of these, and I probably would have enjoyed them a lot more if I didn't have the pressure of having to complete a drawing every day. And again, that's just a pressure that I imposed on myself. It's not one that really existed, but I am really pleased with this little collection. And again, I am excited to paint all of these. I was probably the least excited about the Barnes category this year. I also don't know the location for any of these barns. I think that they're probably all somewhere in North America, either the United States or Canada. And all of them are red except for one, which is white. But I do think that these are going to look better once I paint them. I love this red barn because to me it really feels like it symbolizes that pioneer spirit in America. And I really loved the juxtaposition of all of these flowers in the foreground, which when I paint them will be yellow, but I still think it looks nice even just as ink. And one of the things that I always try to do when I do a drawing is make sure that it stands alone as a good drawing and doesn't really require the paint. You don't have to do that, of course, for line and wash painting or drawing, but I do like to make these ink drawings complete in their own right, and then the watercolor is just a little bit of extra fun. This second barn is the one that was white, and it was really weathered like it needed a paint job. So it was a little bit of white paint, but you could also see the wooden planks beneath in certain areas, and the silo is red brick with this nice hayfield in the foreground. I feel like my composition was slightly off on this, and I'm going to try to save that when I do paint it. I think if I could do this one again, I would zoom in a little bit more, but I do like these trees in the background. And again, I think adding some clouds to the sky and putting some darker values here when I paint it, going back to the barn, will make it a lot more interesting. And again, these barns were the last category that I used the Prismacolor fine liners. I was struggling with them a little bit on this cotton paper, so after the barns, I switched to the Staedtler. This is one of those abandoned barns, not unlike many barns that you'll find in North America, and it always makes me so sad that so many of these barns have fallen into disrepair or are completely gone. And that's another reason that I really love to draw and paint barns, because in another 100 years, I don't know how many of these will be left at all. So I do feel like they're capturing a moment in time and an era. I'm not sure that I really captured the foliage that's growing over the barn very effectively, but I was pretty happy with these trees that are overhanging in the foreground. But I do have to say this one and the previous one are probably among my least favorite of all the drawings that I did this whole month. I had a lot of fun with this final barn, specifically with the masking fluid and putting in a lot of different branches in the foreground and then going over it with the fine liner and later removing it. I think it gives it a really nice, spooky look. And it also adds a lot of visual texture. So of all the barns that I drew, I think this one is probably my favorite this year. Mostly because I just really like the different textures that I created in the foreground and in the trees and even on the barn itself. So I would say overall, these two I like the best and these two I like the worst. I had really high hopes for them, but I don't think I chose the best barns. And again, usually when I draw barns, I take the photographs myself, and so I feel a different sort of connection with them. I was really excited for the church category this year, but I think it also, like the barns, was probably one of the most disappointing ones. And I definitely felt like I was still in a drawing slump here. While I was drawing these, I felt like I should quit. And I couldn't quit because I had announced it to the world that I was doing these drawings. I knew that I wanted to. I had committed to it. And it's something that I was sharing with my patrons over on Patreon. So they were also drawing along with me, and many of them were posting their drawings online on the community posts page, which was really lovely to see and really did help motivate me to keep going, because I know had I not made the video announcing it and then also shared it on Patreon, I probably would have bailed on this challenge this year. So I'm really grateful to them and to all of you as well who drew along with me and gave me some inspiration even on depressing days when my drawings were not going as planned. I'm not certain where this first church is. I believe, based on the comments that I saw on Pinterest, that it's somewhere in Iceland. And again, I did use the masking fluid on this one for the white around the windows on the church and also the flowers in the foreground. Again, this is one that I think is going to be really fun to paint, especially once I put those flowers in. They were white, but they have a little bit of blue in them, and there are also some blue lupines as well. I was having difficulty getting the right texture and value on the roof, so I'm not so happy with that, but I do like the foreground and the windows, and I do like all of the slight imperfections in it. This next church as well, I'm not sure where it is. I believe this is in Russia. I didn't have as much time to do this one as I would have liked, so the mountains are a little bit lazy, and I think all of the foliage around the church itself is a bit rushed feeling. So again, this is one that I hope that I can save later with paint, but it's not too bad. I liked drawing the architecture. I especially love these little towers that you see. This is an architectural feature that you can see a lot in Eastern European architecture, or even just other European countries, and I love the surrounding scenery on this one. The location of this next one is unknown. It could be in America, but it also could be in Europe. I really loved the symmetry of the architecture. I loved the tower, and I really liked this field of wheat in the foreground. Of all of the churches that I drew, this one is my favorite because I was happy with a lot of the different textures that I achieved on the building, and also in the trees and the wheat. I did use a masking fluid on this one for the windows, a little bit of the trees, and the wheat in the foreground as well. This final church is called the Church of St. Sebastian. It's in Ramsau, Germany. And again, it has that beautiful tower that really attracted me to it. But I also loved the mountains in the background and the fact that it's next to this river. Although you can't see much of the river in this drawing because I zoomed in more on the church. I also really loved the way that the light source created these really stark shadows. So here you can see the shadow from the church and also here along the riverbank. I did use the masking fluid on this one for some of the white areas in the mountains and also for some of the grasses in the foreground. This was about the time when I was wondering why I had chosen such difficult subject matter. But the nice thing about choosing different categories is that you really only have to stick with each category for a few days and then you're on to the next thing. And also every category that I tried, I would learn something new about that type of building. So I did appreciate the practice in drawing the different towers and also some of the curved towers. And I really had a lot of fun with the masking fluid marker on this one and creating different textures. The castles category was a lot of fun, but again, super challenging because I wasn't just drawing one structure or a part of one structure. I was actually drawing complicated buildings, often a collection of different buildings with interesting backgrounds that posed challenges of their own. This first one, I'm not sure where it is, but it's somewhere in the Highlands of Scotland, and it really captured my attention because I loved the extreme contrasts of the light lights with the dark darks. So again, this photograph was likely taken at the end of the day. And I also loved that it was on this rocky crag. I kind of went with the idea that less is more on this one, and in fact for all of the castles, because I didn't want them to be too busy. Because they all came with a collection of different buildings, my aim was more on getting the lights and the darks more accurate and less on being super detailed. Probably the most challenging of this one was getting all of the rocks and the bushes done and making those look realistic. But I was really happy with this one. And again, on this one, I was really enjoying the Staedtler fine liners. This second one is also in Scotland. It's Eilean Donan Castle, and I've drawn this one before. In fact, I did a super teeny tiny little drawing of this about a year ago, or actually it might have been just last spring. Probably the most challenging thing about this was getting the towers correct. I feel like I was a little bit off on some of those, but as my husband says, a man with a galloping horse probably won't notice that. And again, I had a lot of fun doing the foliage and putting in the really dark shadows. This next one is not technically a castle. It's actually an intake tower on a lake that's near a dam in Wales. Again, there was a lot of really nice contrast between the lights and the darks on this one, And it was a lot of fun to draw all of the foliage in the background, including the tiny trees up on the hills and the bridge on the lake. So yeah, overall, I'm pretty pleased with that one. This final castle is unknown. I have no idea where it is. I'm going to hazard a guess that it's somewhere in Europe or Eastern Europe. If you know, please let me know. I had a lot more fun with this one. I felt a bit more relaxed. In fact, for each of these drawings, that's pretty much the way it went. If I had more time and was feeling more rested and relaxed, usually the drawings are better. No surprise. This one had so many details, and again, they are definitely not perfect, but I think that they're probably good enough. I think my favorite thing to draw on this one was the bridge, as well as the mountains in the background. And I do think this will be a fun one to paint. But yeah, this was definitely one of those that I was shaking my head and asking myself, what was I thinking? Why did I possibly think it would be a good idea to draw a castle a day? I'm not sure which one is my favorite. I kind of like all of them for different reasons. I think probably the least successful is the Eileen Donan castle, because I don't think that my darks and lights are as effective as they probably could have been. So if I do go in later and paint that one, I will want to make sure that I'm adding a little bit more contrast in the value. I'd say probably my favorites on this are the first one and the last one, though I do like the intake tower in Wales as well. The next category were a huge relief because I decided to just do some cottages. That said, they weren't a total relief because there was a lot of foliage around all of these in the background as well as in the foreground. This one is probably the most disappointing, but also the one that I think is going to have a big impact once it's painted. It's a very autumnal scene, probably early autumn when the leaves are falling off of the trees. This was an image that I believe I got on Unsplash, and I was really drawn to this collection of flowers. In the photograph, they're all whites and yellows and oranges, and that in juxtaposition with a bit of a rust-colored roof will make this a beautiful painting. That said, I am pretty happy with the drawing as well, even though, I don't know, in my mind I thought it was going to be a little bit better than it is. I still like it. This little cottage was a lot of fun to draw. Again, this is one that really was drawn to be painted because it's a pink cottage with little teal or bluish trim and lots of pink flowers on this vine as well as in the foreground. But it was really fun to draw as well, and I think it really functions nicely as a drawing. And this is one of those that would be a lot of fun to paint because once I make several copies of it, I could do different color combinations for the cottage and the flowers and really change things up. And again, I did use masking fluid on this one for the details of the porch railings and pillars, and also a lot of the flowers in the foreground and that vine that extends over the porch. Next, we have a little hobbit house. I just love hobbit houses. This one could be in Hobbiton in New Zealand. I'm not really sure, or it could be one that somebody built. Again, if you have any idea, let me know in the description. I loved the little details of the laundry hanging above it on the hill, and I loved the round door on this one as well. If my memory serves me correctly, I was pretty tired when I drew this one, so I did go in a few days later and enhance some of the values to put in some of the darks. But I think, again, this is going to be a really fun one to paint. This final one was a lot of fun because I went crazy with the masking fluid marker. In fact, maybe a little bit too much because you can see I had a little bit of difficulty picking it up in some areas where you see a little bit of a blue cast. The things I was the happiest with on this were the fact that even as a black and white ink drawing, it feels very snowy. And that came really with the contrast of the whites and also the darks, as well as this pine tree in the foreground where you can definitely see some heavy snowy branches, and here above the porch as well. This one will be a lot of fun to paint, but again, it really isn't going to be necessary. I'm really pleased with the drawing on its own. I think if I were to pick a favorite or a few favorites, definitely the last one, the snowy one, is my favorite. But I think they're all going to be really nice as paintings. And I do think they all exude a charm of their own, which is what I was going for. With the exception maybe of the first one in the woods. I'm not sure how charming that looks as a drawing, but as a painting, I promise, I think it's going to look pretty good. These clock towers were one of my favorite categories, and although I know they aren't technically houses, I had a lot of fun doing all of the different architectural details on these. This first one is probably my least favorite because I think the composition is a little bit boring, mostly because there's no foliage surrounding it. So I think when it does come time to paint it, and to paint in the shadows, it's going to have a lot more visual interest. I did wonder, as I started drawing these, what on earth I was thinking to decide to draw clock towers with their circles, which present challenges of their own. But I am pretty happy with this one. This second one is from a photograph that I took, although I did take a photograph that someone else took of this clock tower and put that on my Pinterest, but I will add my photograph to my Pinterest board for this at some point. And again, if you're interested in drawing any of these, I'll link my Pinterest board in the description so that you can see all of these photographs for yourself. This is a clock tower that actually goes over the high street in a little town called Cottages, which is near where I live. It's the most charming village, and I'm always really drawn to this clock tower. I chose to zoom in on it a bit more. It is a very hilly high street, so actually as I was taking the photograph, I could see this clock, and then of course you go downhill and under the clock tower here. It was a lot of fun drawing the bunting hanging over the street. And probably the most challenging aspect of this was all of the buildings on the right and the left, but it wasn't too bad, and I'm really happy with this one. This third one is also an unknown location. I'm not sure where it is. If I had to guess, I might think it's in Germany, but I don't know. If it looks like a familiar structure to you, let me know because I would love to know. I loved this big bush in the foreground as well as the street light, and I think that was a big challenge, but also a lot of fun to draw. And I do love medieval architecture, so it was a lot of fun to draw all of the woodwork as well. And the clock tower was fun too. And finally, this is another clock tower of an unknown location. This is probably my favorite of all of the clock towers, and maybe one of my favorites of everything that I drew this whole month. Maybe even almost ever. I really had a lot of fun drawing it. I spent a lot of time on this one. I was really chilled, just watching TV, relaxing. I probably spent 4 or 5 hours, not continuously drawing, but very slowly drawing this one. And I think you can tell that I was really loving the process by the result. I loved all of the vines creeping up over the sides. I loved the windows and the clock face itself, and also all of the surrounding foliage. Architecturally, this one was definitely fun to draw. Maybe a little bit challenging to deliberately eliminate putting in some of the details, but I think that's what makes a drawing a little bit more special. The look that I was going for with all of these drawings was for them to have a bit of an element of a sketch about them. I didn't want them to be perfect architectural drawings. That said, I did want them to be a little more perfect than just an imperfect sketch where windows and lines might not be as accurate as they could be. But this was definitely the category that made me so happy that I had stayed with the challenge because, like I said, these are some of my favorite drawings that I've ever done. And again, my favorites on this are the Totnes Tower, as well as the last one with all of the ivy climbing up the sides. What do you think? Which one is your favorite? The final category only has 3 drawings instead of 4 because of the fact that there are only 31 days in October. And the category for this was houseboats. This first one is a photograph taken by a friend of mine, and it's of a boat that she actually lived in for a few years. I don't think she lives there anymore. I have to check with her. But this was a photograph that she took that always really appealed to me, and she did give me her permission to draw it. This is one of those ones that I really want to paint because the boat is green and it's just so charming. I loved the bunting and all of the flowers on the dock. I loved the little dinghy that's right next to the boat. In the photograph, there were a lot more boats surrounding it, but I wanted to keep the focus on the boat itself. So I did put in a little bit of a suggestion of some of the other boats, but most of this was just the boat itself. And I'm pretty pleased with this one. This next one is probably my least favorite because I don't think that I got the values as good as I could have. That said, there wasn't a really strong light source in the photo itself, which always makes it a little bit more challenging. So I chose to amp up the highlights on the left side of the boat and darken them a bit more on this underhang and over on the right to help give more of an illusion of a stronger light source. I do love the little boat, although I think my favorite parts of this drawing are the trees in the background as well as the reflections in the water. And I did use the masking fluid marker for those reflections as well as some of the white areas in this porch area. For this last one, I wanted to do the drawing of a canal boat that a friend of mine lives in, but I didn't really have any good pictures of it. And this picture that I found on Pinterest really stood out to me. And this is a photograph that was taken on the Shropshire Union Canal in England. I loved the bridge in the background and the steam coming out from one of the chimneys. I loved the little tiny cat and all of the fun details on the boat itself. So this one is definitely my favorite of all the boats, although I do like my friend's houseboat as well. I did use the masking fluid marker to give that illusion of the steam coming out of the chimney here. I love the romance of living on a boat or traveling on a boat. I don't know if I could ever do it myself. I don't know if I'm hardy enough anymore, but definitely it's something that I would like to experience at least maybe for a week or a few days at some point in my life. So those are my 31 drawings for the month of October. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you some ideas and inspiration for drawings of your own. If you've seen any of my videos before, you might know that I really love month-long challenges, both to challenge yourself and also help you improve your own artistic skills. But you obviously don't need to spend anywhere near the amount of time that I did on these. Like I said, I usually spend a lot less time on these monthly Housetober drawings. Thank you so much for being here. If you're still here, thank you for watching. I hope you all have a beautiful day and happy drawing.